In 1841, on a small volcanic island in the Indian Ocean called Reunion, a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund walked out into a garden of orchid vines that had refused to bear fruit for years. The plantation owner had tried everything. Botanists across the French Empire had tried everything. For decades, growers on this island had planted thousands of vanilla vines shipped in from Mexico, vines that flowered beautifully every single year, and every single year produced almost nothing. No pods, no seeds, no profit. Just a wall of green leaves and a fortune in wasted soil. Entire colonial agricultural budgets had gone into this failed experiment, and some of the best botanical minds in France had failed to solve it. But on that day, a child with no formal training and no freedom picked up a thin sliver of grass, lifted the flap of a single vanilla blossom by hand, and pressed 2 parts of the flower together that nature had never allowed to touch. The flower produced a pod. Vanilla, the second most expensive spice in the world today, a spice more costly per pound than silver for most of its recorded history, exists in mass quantities anywhere outside of Mexico because of that one motion made by that one child on that one morning. And here is the part that should make you angry. For over a century afterward, almost nobody knew his name. So how did a tropical orchid, a plant most people today only think about as a bland description for something boring, a vanilla wedding, a vanilla personality, become one of the most labor-intensive, fraud-riddled, and historically contested crops on Earth? This story does not start in France or on a plantation. It starts in a jungle about 1,000 years before any European ever laid eyes on it, in the humid lowlands of what is now eastern Mexico. Vanilla belongs to the orchid family, and orchids are, by a wide margin, the largest family of flowering plants on the planet, with tens of thousands of species. Almost none of them produce anything edible. Vanilla is the exception, and even among vanilla species, only one, Vanilla planifolia, produces the pod that the entire global industry is built on. The plant is native to the tropical forests of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where it grew as a climbing vine, wrapping itself around host trees and producing small, pale, greenish-yellow flowers. The people who first cultivated it were the Totonac, an indigenous civilization centered around the region of Papantla in what is today the state of Veracruz. Long before the Aztec Empire existed, the Totonac had already figured out how to harvest the pods of this wild vine, cure them through a slow process of sweating and drying in the sun, and use the resulting dark, fragrant sticks in food, medicine, and ritual. They did not know the word pollination. They did not know that a single tiny, stingless bee, native only to this region, was doing the work for them in the wild. They were harvesting the product of an ecological accident that existed nowhere else on the planet, and they built an entire tradition around it without understanding why it worked at all. The Totonac cured their pods using a method that, in its broad strokes, is still recognizable in vanilla curing today. Alternating periods of sun exposure with periods spent wrapped and sweating. A slow chemical transformation that turned a flavorless green pod into the dark, oily, intensely fragrant spice the world now recognizes. This was not guesswork stumbled into once. This was generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge, patience, experimentation, and an intimate understanding of a single wild vine, refined long before anyone on the Totonac coast had ever heard of Europe, chemistry, or the word vanillin. Now, Totonac legend holds that vanilla was born from tragedy. The story tells of a princess named Sakopontziza, whose name roughly translates to morning star, who fell in love with a young man outside of her royal status. Forbidden from marrying, the two fled into the forest, where they were caught and beheaded by priests as punishment. Where their blood soaked into the earth, the story says, a vine grew, climbing up a nearby bush, and from that vine bloomed the first vanilla orchid. Now, that story is almost certainly a myth, layered with later retellings and colonial influence. But the fact that a civilization built an entire origin story of forbidden love and sacrifice around this one plant tells you how deeply it was woven into their culture, long before it ever had a price tag attached to it. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to dominance in central Mexico in the 15th century, the Totonac had been conquered and folded into the Aztec tribute system. And this is where vanilla takes its first step toward becoming an economic weapon, rather than just a local flavoring. The Aztecs, who called it Tlilchochitl, meaning black flower, demanded vanilla pods as tribute from the Totonac people, alongside cacao, gold, feathers, and textiles. Vanilla was blended with cacao to make a bitter, spiced drink reserved almost exclusively for nobility, priests, and warriors. A drink so valuable that commoners were forbidden from consuming it. Think about that for a second. Chocolate itself was a luxury reserved for the elite, and vanilla was the ingredient that elevated it even further, transforming a bitter ceremonial drink into something closer to what modern chocolate actually tastes like. Vanilla was not just a flavor, it was a marker of rank, a form of currency, and a component of a beverage tied directly to religious and military power. Halfway around the world, Europe knew absolutely nothing about any of this. That changed in 1519 when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortez arrived on the shores of Mexico and within 2 years brought down the Aztec Empire. Cortez and his men encountered the chocolate and vanilla drink at the court of Moctezuma II, and by most accounts found it strange, bitter, and unpleasant at first. But Spanish colonizers eventually brought both cacao and vanilla back to Spain, and by the late 16th century, the flavored chocolate drink had become fashionable among Spanish royalty and clergy. For nearly 100 years, Spain guarded the source of vanilla as closely as it guarded the source of its American silver. Only pods harvested from Mexico, and specifically from vines pollinated by a small, stingless bee found almost nowhere else, called Melipona beechii, could produce viable fruit. Spain controlled the trade route, Spain controlled the supply, and Spain had absolutely no idea why the plant would not grow anywhere else. This is the detail that makes the whole story strange. Nobody understood the biological mechanism behind vanilla pollination for roughly 3 centuries. Growers across the Spanish, French, and later English empires attempted to transplant vanilla vines to their own tropical colonies throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and every single attempt produced the same result: lush, healthy vines, beautiful flowers, almost no fruit. Here is the uncomfortable reality that colonial botany spent generations trying to avoid admitting. They were transplanting a plant without transplanting the one insect that made it reproduce. The Melipona bee, along with a handful of hummingbird species, also believed to assist pollination in its native range, simply did not exist outside of Mexico and parts of Central America. Vanilla flowers only remain open and receptive for a single day. Inside that flower is a thin membrane called the rostellum, which separates the male and female reproductive parts and prevents the plant from self-pollinating. Without an insect precisely suited to bypass that membrane, the flower blooms, wilts, and falls, unfertilized, over and over, year after year. European growers had exported a spice without exporting its ecosystem, and it would take roughly 300 years, dozens of failed colonial agricultural programs, and one enslaved child to figure out why. Meanwhile, in Europe, vanilla was undergoing its own strange cultural journey. In the early 17th century, an apothecary to England's Queen Elizabeth I, a man named Hugh Morgan, is credited with the idea of using vanilla on its own, separated from chocolate, as a standalone flavoring. This idea slowly spread across European aristocracy, and vanilla began appearing in perfumes, medicines, and desserts by the 18th century. And no, that is not something anyone made up. Physicians of the era genuinely debated the medicinal properties of vanilla, with some arguing it acted as an aphrodisiac, others prescribing it for fevers, and still others warning that it caused hysteria in women, a real theological and medical argument made by real physicians in real European courts. Vanilla by this point was worth an extraordinary sum, and virtually the entire global supply still came from a single narrow strip of Mexican coastline, sold through Spanish and later Mexican merchant middlemen who guarded the true cultivation process as a trade secret. For roughly 300 years after Cortez first tasted it, Mexico held an effective monopoly on the entire world's vanilla supply, not through force, but through a biological lock that nobody outside the region could pick. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In the early 19th century, French colonial administrators, desperate to break Mexico's grip on the vanilla trade, shipped vanilla cuttings to French colonial territories across the Indian Ocean, including the islands of Réunion, then called Île Bourbon, Mauritius, and later Madagascar and the Comoros. The vines took root immediately. The climate was nearly perfect, and the vines produced almost no fruit at all, for the exact same reason growers everywhere else had failed for centuries. No Melipona bee, no pollination, no pods. French colonial officials on Réunion spent years experimenting, hand-transferring pollen with brushes and tools in imitation of the bee, and largely failing, producing only a trickle of viable pods through painstaking and inconsistent effort. The entire venture was on the verge of being abandoned as an expensive, embarrassing failure. Then, in 1841, a plantation owner and amateur botanist on Réunion named Fériol Bellier-Beaumont, who had taken an interest in vanilla cultivation on his estate, had among his enslaved workers a 12-year-old boy named Edmund. Edmund had been born into slavery on the plantation itself, and by most accounts had shown a sharp curiosity about the vanilla vines Bellier-Beaumont was struggling to cultivate. Edmund is said to have observed the structure of the flower closely and devised a technique using a thin sliver of bamboo or grass to lift the rostellum, the membrane blocking self-fertilization, and press the male and female parts of the flower together with his thumb, mimicking in seconds what centuries of Spanish, French, and English botanists had failed to replicate at all. Whether every detail of how Edmund arrived at this technique has survived accurately through the historical record remains debated among scholars, since much of what we know comes from later accounts recorded by Bellier-Beaumont and colonial officials, rather than from Edmund himself. But the result is beyond dispute. The vines on Réunion began producing pods reliably, at scale, for the first time in the history of vanilla cultivation outside of Mexico. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the next part of vanilla's history is where the injustice gets almost unbearable to sit with. Edmund's technique spread across Réunion within a few years, taught to other enslaved workers on neighboring plantations. And by the 1850s and 1860s, it had reached Madagascar and the Comoros as well. This single method, now known globally as hand pollination, remains, to this day, in the 21st century, the primary way that virtually all commercially grown vanilla is pollinated anywhere in the world outside of Mexico's native range. Every single vanilla pod grown in Madagascar, which today produces roughly 80% of the world's natural vanilla supply, is pollinated by a human hand, one flower at a time, in a technique invented by a child who was not free to profit from it, patent it, or even fully control the story of his own discovery. Think about that for a second. The 80% of vanilla flavor most of the world consumes today exists because of a technique that traces back to one enslaved 12-year-old's hands in a garden he did not own, working under a system that legally classified him as property. Slavery was abolished in the French colonies in 1848, 7 years after Edmund's discovery, and Edmund himself was freed, along with the other enslaved people of Réunion. He took the surname Albus and spent much of the rest of his life in poverty, reportedly working at times as a kitchen servant, despite the fact that vanilla exports from Réunion and the surrounding islands were by that point generating enormous colonial revenue. Beaumont, to his credit, by the standards of the time, did publicly acknowledge Edmund's role in the discovery in later years and lobbied colonial authorities on his behalf. But Edmund received no meaningful financial reward. He died in 1880, reportedly in poverty, and it was only in the 20th and 21st centuries, as historians re-examined the colonial agricultural records of Réunion, that Edmund Albus began to receive more widespread public recognition as the person responsible for making vanilla a global commodity. This was not a footnote. This was the single technological breakthrough that transformed vanilla from a Mexican regional specialty into a worldwide industry. And for well over 100 years, almost nobody outside of specialist historical circles knew his name. Back in Mexico, the discovery of hand pollination on the other side of the world was catastrophic for the vanilla economy that had sustained the region for 3 centuries. Mexico's advantage had never been climate. It had been biological exclusivity, the accident of geography that kept the Melipona bee, and therefore vanilla cultivation, locked to one corner of the planet. Once hand pollination made that irrelevant, vanilla could be grown anywhere with the right climate and enough cheap, skilled labor. And French colonial territories in the Indian Ocean had both in abundance under a colonial labor system that, even after formal slavery ended, continued to rely on poorly compensated agricultural workers. By the early 20th century, Madagascar, Réunion, and the Comoros collectively marketed under the term bourbon vanilla, referring to the old colonial name of Réunion, rather than the American whiskey, had eclipsed Mexico as the dominant source of the world's vanilla supply. Mexico's centuries-long monopoly, unbroken by empires, wars, and colonial botanical programs for 300 years, was ended within a single generation by the hands of a child nobody had bothered to properly credit. This is the part that does not get enough credit either. Growing vanilla, even after Edmund's breakthrough solved the pollination problem, remained, and remains today, one of the most labor-intensive agricultural processes for any major spice on Earth. A vanilla flower blooms for only a single morning and must be hand-pollinated within a narrow window of just a few hours, or it will wilt, unfertilized, and fall from the vine. This means that during flowering season, workers must walk the vines at dawn, every single day for weeks, checking each individual blossom by hand. Once pollinated, a pod takes roughly 9 months to mature on the vine, almost the exact length of a human pregnancy. And even then, the pod is green, odorless, and flavorless. The entire vanilla aroma the world associates with the spice does not exist naturally in a freshly picked pod at all. It is created afterward, through a curing process that can take 3 to 6 months, involving alternating cycles of blanching the pods in hot water, sweating them, wrapped in blankets to trigger enzymatic reactions, sun-drying them by day, and conditioning them in sealed boxes to slowly develop their signature compounds, chief among them a molecule called vanillin. From flower to finished cured pod, ready for market, the process can take close to a full year, with almost every single step performed by hand. You have to understand the scale of this labor to understand why vanilla costs what it costs. A single hectare of vanilla vines can require hundreds of hours of hand pollination labor across a single flowering season, with skilled workers able to pollinate perhaps 1,000 or more flowers in a single morning, moving vine to vine with nothing but a thin stick and a practiced thumb. Miss the window on a given flower even by a few hours, and that flower is gone for the year. No fruit, no income from that blossom at all. This is not a process that can simply be sped up or automated at scale. Despite more than a century of scientific effort, no cost-effective mechanical or robotic alternative to hand pollination has ever been successfully deployed in commercial vanilla farming anywhere in the world. In the 21st century, in an age of satellite-guided harvesters and gene-edited crops, the world's vanilla supply still depends every single year on human fingers doing exactly what Edmund Albus figured out how to do in 1841. This labor intensity is precisely why vanilla has, for most of its post-Edmund history, remained one of the most expensive spices in the world by weight, regularly trading at prices higher than silver on international commodity markets, and in some periods within recent decades, spiking to prices exceeding gold. In 2017, a devastating cyclone struck Madagascar, destroying a significant portion of the vanilla crop, just as global demand from the natural foods and clean label food industries was surging. Prices for raw vanilla beans spiked to over $500 per kilogram, an astronomical increase that rippled through the global food and cosmetics industry and made vanilla, gram for gram, more expensive than many precious metals. And here is the twist that most people never hear about. Because vanilla is so labor-intensive to grow and so valuable on the open market, vanilla theft has become a serious criminal issue in Madagascar, with farmers in some regions harvesting their pods slightly before full ripeness, specifically to prevent them from being stolen off the vine at night, and some communities establishing vigilante security patrols, and even branding individual pods with tattoo-like markings to prove ownership. Vanilla, the flavor most associated in the Western world with plainness, simplicity, and blandness, is stolen at night by armed patrols in parts of rural Madagascar because it is worth more, pound for pound, than most consumer goods on the planet. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains just how upside down this economy can get. During peak price years, Farming communities in the vanilla-growing regions of Madagascar have seen sudden and dramatic shifts in local wealth, with some vanilla farmers earning in a single good harvest sums that rival or exceed what teachers, nurses, or government officials in the same region earn annually. That kind of sudden windfall has reshaped entire towns, funding new houses, motorbikes, and schools in communities that had little access to that kind of capital before. But it has also fueled exactly the kind of theft, violence, and vigilante justice that accompanies any commodity boom built on a resource that is fragile, perishable, and impossible to lock behind a vault. In a world without refrigeration or long-term storage for unripe pods, an unharvested vanilla vine hanging heavy with green fruit is not a stored asset. It is a target, sitting in plain sight in an open field for months at a time. Meanwhile, back in the industrialized world, a very different vanilla story was unfolding, one driven not by agriculture, but by chemistry. In 1874, German scientists Wilhelm Hamann and Karl Reimer succeeded in synthesizing vanillin, the primary flavor and aroma compound in natural vanilla, from a compound derived from pine tree bark. This was not a small development. It was the beginning of an entirely parallel vanilla industry, one that did not require orchids, hand pollination, tropical climates, or 9 months of curing at all. Synthetic vanillin could be produced cheaply, at industrial scale, in a laboratory, in a matter of days rather than a year. By the early 20th century, chemists had also discovered that vanillin could be synthesized from a byproduct of the wood pulp and paper industry called lignin. And, by the mid-20th century, most vanillin used in mass-market food production, including in the overwhelming majority of vanilla ice cream, cookies, and flavored beverages sold worldwide, came not from vanilla orchids at all, but from wood pulp waste. Today, the majority of vanillin used globally is actually synthesized from a petrochemical compound called guaiacol. Here is the number that tends to surprise people. Real vanilla, the kind extracted from cured orchid pods grown by hand in Madagascar, Uganda, and a handful of other tropical regions, accounts for only a small, single-digit percentage of the total vanilla flavoring consumed worldwide. The overwhelming majority of the vanilla flavor in your life, in your ice cream, in your candles, in your perfume, likely never touched an orchid at all. This was not about seasoning food anymore. Synthetic vanillin was about volume, consistency, and price. 3 things that a hand-pollinated tropical orchid grown thousands of miles away could never reliably offer a mass food manufacturer. A gram of natural vanilla extract requires months of tropical labor, curing sheds, and exposure to weather, currency swings, and theft. A gram of synthetic vanillin requires a chemical reactor and a few days. For an industry producing millions of units of flavored food and drink every single day, that difference was not a minor efficiency. It was the entire business model. This is also why, on packaging today, the word choice matters more than people realize. A product labeled with vanilla or vanilla extract, by regulatory definition in the United States and several other countries, must derive that flavor from the actual vanilla plant. A product labeled vanilla flavor or artificial vanilla flavor is telling you, quietly, in a legally required distinction most shoppers never notice, that what you are tasting almost certainly never grew on a vine at all. Today, global vanilla production is dominated overwhelmingly by Madagascar, which produces roughly 80% of the world's natural vanilla, followed at a distance by Indonesia, and much smaller amounts from countries including Papua New Guinea, Uganda, Mexico itself, and India. The natural vanilla market despite being a tiny fraction of overall vanilla flavor consumption by volume, is valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And the broader vanillin flavoring industry, natural and synthetic combined, is valued in the billions. But vanilla is far more than just a food flavoring, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Vanillin and vanilla extract are used extensively in the perfume industry, forming the base note in an enormous number of fragrances, prized for a warm, comforting scent profile that blends well with almost anything. Vanilla compounds are also used in pharmaceuticals, sometimes as a masking agent to make bitter medications more palatable to patients, and in some cosmetic and industrial products purely for its scent. Researchers have even explored vanillin as a potential building block in green chemistry, investigating ways to convert it into precursor compounds for biodegradable plastics, an area of ongoing scientific research into more sustainable materials. A flower that an enslaved 12-year-old boy learned to fertilize by hand in 1841 may end up, within our lifetimes, contributing to alternatives for petroleum-based plastic. And here is one more twist worth sitting with before we close this out. Because natural vanilla remains so expensive and so vulnerable to weather disasters, currency shifts, and theft, food and fragrance companies have poured enormous research investment into biotechnology as an alternative path to authentic vanillin, one that does not rely on petrochemicals or wood pulp at all. In recent years, scientists have successfully used genetically engineered yeast and bacteria in fermentation processes to produce vanillin that is molecularly identical to the compound found in a cured vanilla pod, grown not in a tropical curing shed, but in a steel fermentation tank in a matter of days. Whether this biotech vanillin ever meaningfully displaces either the cheap petrochemical version or the expensive hand-pollinated natural version remains an open question, one that food companies, farmers in Madagascar, and consumers who care about where their flavor comes from are all watching closely. It was there in the sacred chocolate drinks of Aztec nobility, reserved for kings and warriors, while commoners were forbidden even a taste. It was there, guarded as a Spanish colonial secret for 300 years, worth a fortune to an empire that never understood why the plant would not grow anywhere else. It was there, in the failed gardens of French colonial botanists who spent decades and fortunes trying and failing to unlock a biological puzzle a child would eventually solve in an afternoon. It was there in the hands of Edmund Albus, enslaved, unpaid, and largely uncredited for most of a century, holding the technique that would make vanilla a global commodity rather than a regional secret. It was there in the smoke and sweat of curing sheds in Madagascar, where farmers today still walk their vines at dawn, checking each individual flower by hand, exactly as workers did 180 years ago. And it is there now, in your kitchen, in a small brown bottle of extract you probably bought for a few dollars, in the plainest, most boring-sounding dessert on the menu: vanilla ice cream, vanilla cake, vanilla yogurt, a word that has become a synonym in the English language for basic, unremarkable, and plain. Not bad for a flower that once traded for more than its weight in silver, and whose entire modern existence traces back to the hands of a child the world nearly forgot. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail caught you off guard the most, whether it was the bee, the boy, or the fact that most vanilla flavor in the world never came from a vanilla plant at all. And if you want more stories like this, stories about the ordinary things in your kitchen that quietly shaped empires, economies, and lives, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more of them coming. And I will see you in the next one.